Hi, you're watching theAnalysis.news, and I'm Talia Baroncelli. Today I'll be joined by economist Djavad Salehi-Isfahani, who will be speaking about the effects of US sanctions on Iran. If you'd like to support us, you can go to our website, theanalysis.news, hit the donate button at the top right corner of the screen, and make sure you're on our mailing list. That way all of our content can get sent straight to your inbox. You can also watch us on YouTube. Make sure you hit the bell. That way you get all of our notifications, or listen to us on podcast streaming services such as Apple or Spotify. All right, let's get into it with Djavad Salehi-Isfahani. Joining me now is economist Djavad Salehi-Isfahani. He's a professor of economics at Virginia Tech University in the US and is also a research fellow at the Economic Research Forum in Cairo and research affiliate at the Middle East Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School. He recently co-authored a book called How Sanctions Work, Iran and the Impact of Economic Warfare, which he co-authored together with Narges Bajogli, Ali Vaez, and Vali Nasser. So Djavad, it's really great to have you here today. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I look forward to our discussion.
So US President Trump recently slapped additional sanctions on Iran. He said that he hated doing so, but just had to do it in order to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. In response, the Iranian Supreme Leader Khamenei said that Iran would not be threatened or coerced to come to the negotiating table. And the foreign minister Araghchi recently echoed this sentiment, saying that Iran would not enter into direct negotiations with the US on the nuclear issue as long as they were being threatened with sanctions. So I wanted to speak to you about the general effect of US sanctions on Iran and whether sanctions actually have their intended effect, which is something you discuss in your book, How Sanctions Work.
Well, there's no mystery that US has economic power. Iran has a particular weakness in that it's an oil exporter, one among many. And when its oil exports are curtailed, banned by US sanctions, that it will take a hit. The economy will take a hit. Iran depends on oil exports for running most of its production. Capital goods, intermediate goods, manufacturing suffers, but there's also food imports that are curtailed. The way to think about this is that you have an external shock, like a lot of countries do. It's not something that developing countries are unfamiliar with. Every now and then their export revenues go down, they lose foreign currency because of capital flight, and they have to adjust to that. It's called austerity. So Iran has experienced austerity, and to the extent that that was the goal of the sanctioners, United States and Europe, they succeeded. They've hit the economy relatively hard. But if they wanted to get some foreign policy outcome from it, which is their stated objective, to stop Iran from enriching uranium, then they failed miserably because enrichment has increased significantly since sanctions began. And the latest wave of sanctions or the ratcheting up of sanctions in 2018, when President Trump, during his first term, left the then agreement, the 2015 nuclear accord between Iran and the world powers, the economy took a dive, but Iran was defiant and was able to increase its enrichment so that now it's reached a very critical point. They have enough nuclear material with 60% enrichment that they can make several bombs, according to the news reports. So in that sense, yes, it has failed, I would say, overall. Let me tell you something, the way I look at this, because you mentioned President Trump again imposed sanctions. This has become like a habit for US governments when they find Iran not responding to their initiatives, that they find something new to put on the news cycle, like they have more sanctions. And I think of it sometimes as something we are all familiar with. When you are in a bus stop and the bus is not coming, it's not coming. At some point, it becomes very difficult for you to leave because you think you have accumulated enough credit or waiting time that you shouldn't be leaving now. And I think that's what's happening with sanctions. Their understanding, American understanding, is that we have hurt the economy so much, and the other stuff is happening, like the war in Gaza and so on. So they think this is now the time when the bus will arrive. We can reap the benefits from sanctions. I don't see that on the horizon right now. All I see is waiting or Iranian suffering without the bus arriving.
That's a good point. I mean, people are waiting, and there's a person that was interviewed in the book, that a woman who spoke about sanctions being so present in her life as if, it was the weather. The weather is something that's always in your life. It's something that you expect to face every day. It's something that you can't get rid of. So in her life, sanctions they always played a role. They were always a factor that she had to deal with. What is the actual, I guess, punitive or threatening effect of sanctions at this point if they've been around for so long? And given that there's really no prospect for them to be removed, how does that factor in to the decision making? Because if the threat no longer really has the desired effect, I mean, of course, it impacts people's lives. People have been suffering. People don't have enough food. There are effects of the sanctions. But if there's no possibility for them to really be removed, then how does that crystallize over time? And what is the result of that?
That's a very good question. One of the things that surprised me watching the sanctions over time is that the sanctioners know how to impose sanctions, but they don't know how to remove it. It's one of those things. It's very hard to, after you have threatened lots of banks, lots of importers not dealing with Iran, to tell them that things are okay now and they can do trade with Iran. And that's partly because when you impose sanctions, it's not all a legal matter. There is a whole host of NGOs, right-wing think tanks who come in and want sanctions to continue. So Obama removed the sanctions or eased the sanctions. But these NGOs, like United Against Nuclear Iran, FDD, these are think tanks or groups in Washington, they would tell other countries that don't get too cozy with Iran. This will not last. Obama is not going to be, that was the last term of Obama, so it was obvious that Obama wasn't going to be around for very long. So removing sanctions is very difficult and has become the main issue because Iranians have experience with Americans trying to remove sanctions, but they can't. So when Trump says that make a deal with me, it's not clear what he means.
Right.
I mean, the subtext is that if you make a deal, reduce enrichment, do this or that, then we will remove sanctions. But everybody knows that Trump is very bad with detail. He doesn't know what it is like to remove sanctions. And I'm sure that people who are around him are not the type who will say, yeah, that's a serious issue. Iranians know about it, so we can't just talk to them like they don't know anything and keep saying we have to make a deal. We have to come with specific proposals. We have to address the shortcomings of the JCPOA. Trump has been very vague on what was really wrong with JCPOA, other than it wasn't my deal, it was Obama's deal, so I don't like it. But he never specified what it is that was wrong, except that it didn't completely bring Iran to his knees. When you listen to the right-wing opponents of the nuclear deal or critics of Iran, that's what they want. They don't like a state that's relatively powerful and is defiant in a neighborhood, meaning the Middle East, where U.S. wants to project its power and keep Israel safe, keep Saudi Arabia, UAE safe, and so on.
Right. And of course, the US neocons, people such as John Bolton, don't even want Iran to be a regional power. They'd like to see regime change, and they weren't in favor of the Chinese brokered rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But Iran is in a slightly different position now. Its regional influence has been curtailed to a certain degree, given that it's not able to fund organizations such as Hezbollah and Hamas to the degree it was before. And if you look at the sanctions, would you say that they benefit a certain segment of Iranian society, that they don't have the same effect across the board, and that perhaps the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, is able to benefit from the sanctions to such a degree that they don't even want the sanctions to be removed? They'd actually like to see them continue.
Yes, there is no question that there are people in Iran, some powerful entities in Iran, that oppose the negotiations with the US. And I wouldn't say they are pro-sanctions. They are not opposed to removing sanctions. I think they recognize that Iran's economy has suffered because of sanctions, and they would like it to get better, but they are not willing to pay the price, and they don't trust the United States. I hear a lot about this term that's become very popular in Iran, Kasban Tahrim, meaning the beneficiaries of sanctions. I don't know exactly who they are and how it is that people benefit. There's no question when the government cannot use the market system, global markets, to sell its oil, move products, and bring the money back, that people come in and say, I can do it for you. And they are protected because of the level of secrecy that's necessary to evade US sanctions. They can then pilfer some of the money and cheat, and corruption arises. So those people have incentives to keep sanctions on. People who develop a specific capital, like Iranians were very good with flying to Frankfurt, making business deals, and coming back with both, business and pleasure. And now they have to go to China, and they have difficulty with that. So other people have invested and they have developed relationships with China. That's a specific trading capital that they will lose if trade moves back again to Western Europe. But I think this focus on economic benefits of sanctions for specific groups misses the point that overall the Iranian elite, political elite, sees this as struggle the way anti-colonial movements have fought. And it would be a mistake to focus too much on this. I know President Rouhani, who was president about 4 or 5 years ago, he faced a lot of opposition for the agreement he had signed, which I thought was a very good agreement because it allowed Iranians to sell oil and do trade and so on. And I was upset that Trump exited that agreement. But he popularized this term, the beneficiaries of sanctions. And I think that's simplification. I'll make one more point besides the fact that there is an anti-colonial sentiment in Iran. It's been there since the British and the Russians were taking liberty with Iranian soil. It was there when the CIA and MI6 deposed the popular Prime Minister Mossadegh. And it was there when the West, especially the United States, supported the Shah, who had a very elitist rule. Now, the point I'm adding actually is during the Shah, globalization, relations with the West became synonymous with a large section of Iranian society with rising inequality. So this issue hasn't been addressed. I'll give you a simple example of the JCPOA. When the JCPOA was signed, that week, the Rouhani administration announced agreements to purchase 200 new planes, a very large order. And I wondered, by the way, I agree Iran needs planes. Nobody disagrees with that. But if you look at it from the point of view of the Iranian poor, who saw sanctions as higher food prices, as inability to get a job and repair their homes and so on, the airplanes seem a very loud way of saying this is not for you. JCPOA is not for you. So I would say successive Iranian governments have blamed failure of their economic policies, especially failure to do global trade or come to agreement with the United States and the West on these profiteers of sanctions, and not address the fact that a lot of Iranians are not quite sure if they're going to come on top if relations with the West are resumed or smooth and Iran becomes again like under the Shah, which is the ideal of many Iranians. That's how they see economic conditions before the revolution and so on. So, I guess I'm done with that point that Iranians are not convinced that a nuclear deal will deliver benefits in terms of more oil exports and in terms of freer global trade. And they also don't know if those benefits are accrued, they go to them, to the section of the population that's always felt economic growth, Western style capitalist growth favors the rich, and they pick up the crumbs. And they are now rallying around, some of them are rallying around this movement that we don't want to negotiate with the US. And I think that's a very dangerous situation because, yes, it's okay not to negotiate with the US, but it is very bad not to recognize that trading globally is essential for economic growth. That people who promise that we can close all the borders and have a robust economy are promising them something that's not achievable, at least in historical experience.
Well, some people must be basing their viewpoints on historical factors, which you already mentioned. For example, under the Shah, there were wider ties with the Western world. And then prior to that, you had companies like the British Petroleum Company essentially stealing all of Iran's natural resources, which led to Mossadegh actually becoming democratically elected because he was opposed to that resource stealing. And of course, they don't necessarily trust Trump because of his discontinuities when it comes to foreign policy. And they obviously don't trust the U.S. administration under Biden, when Biden said that he would bring the U.S. back into the JCPOA, then never actually did so, never actually had an executive order to bring the U.S. back into the agreement. So there's obviously distrust on the part of many Iranians when it comes to the U.S. upholding their side of the agreements they've ratified. So I'm assuming that plays into the rationale of arguing that that Iran should not negotiate with the United States. But my next question would be, does this mean that some Iranians are more willing to have agreements with China, with Russia, for example, or with other countries who have also been who have been sanctioned, who are also at the other end of US sanctions? And my last question is also, is this something that's perhaps affected or motivated the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, given that things are always changing, that maybe to have another friend in the region again is something which is perhaps welcomed given aggressive U.S. foreign policy?
Oh, those are several good points, good questions. Let me just make one quick remark about resource looting. Resource looting stopped when oil prices quadrupled in 1973 under the Shah. I think since then, it doesn't make sense for countries that export oil to equate that with countries like in Central America or Africa that like banana republics. There's a lot of resource looting that's associated with colonialism. Oil exporting countries got free of that because of stuff that happened in the world oil market around early 1970s, right? What they are now concerned about is who gets the benefits of the oil. And for example, if you live in Iran's rural Sistan and Baluchistan, a disadvantaged province, has to be a lot of money coming into Tehran before some of that trickles down. So they are naturally not very enthusiastic about removing sanctions. If you live in Tehran and you have connections to the government, yes, as soon as dollars become available at the central bank, you'll be one of the first to get it and you could do stuff with it. So that brings a kind of a heterogeneity in level of enthusiasm about sanction relief and negotiations with America. You raised another point about Russia, China, and then Saudi Arabia. Actually, those are very different points. Russia and China are powerful countries, and Iranians, I think, are quite aware that becoming sole client for either one is not good for them. And I think one of the reasons why the leadership in Iran is interested in keeping some kind of a agreement with the nuclear watchdog and with Europeans is because they know China and Russia are better partners for them if they can also deal with Western Europe. Now, where Saudi Arabia comes in is a kind of the opposite way. It's exactly trying to walk away from this dependence on China and Russia that Iran tries to become friendly with its own neighbors. I thought that was a very good move because you had Saudi Arabia during the JCPOA negotiations as vehemently against negotiations and sanctions relief as the Likud in Israel. Now they have been able to reverse that. And how they have done it, I think, is in part by brandishing their military power, hitting targets inside Saudi Arabia. So Saudis recognize that you have to be okay with your neighbor, especially if it has weapons. And countries thousands of miles away, like the United States, can't quite protect you. I think this is a very important understanding. Iran did use China to get the agreement to establish diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. But I feel that Iranians are with the Chinese with an understanding that China is also, in some sense, an imperial country. It throws its weights around in Africa, in South Asia, and is not going to be the best friend with Iran. Iran is a weak country, and both China and Russia, I think, if they find a profitable way to use what people call the Iran Trump card, that's not Trump with capital T, is selling out Iran in order to get something. Right now, they're very afraid. A lot of people in Iran are afraid that with Putin and Trump talking, that on the table is the Iran card. And the Americans may say, if you let go of Iran, don't support it, we will let you have Ukraine. That's always a suspicion they have. That's probably why Lavrov traveled to Tehran last week to assure them that's not the case. So I would say this fear that Iran is becoming like North Korea, a client state very close to another big power, it's misunderstanding Iran. Iran is a fairly pluralistic country with multiple interests, multiple views. And so far, they have managed to keep a little bit of the neither East nor West slogan that the revolution came with 45 years ago.
Yeah, you make a very good point that a lot of Iranians are skeptical of imperial powers. That's partly because of the history. I mean, Russia, the imperial Russia was also involved in looting Iran's resources, over a century ago. So that's still in their minds, obviously. But it's also not Russia or China who are sanctioning Iran at the moment. So I think there still is a clear understanding of who is the potential quote unquote enemy in the sense of who is launching the sanctions, which are sort of hollowing out the middle and the working classes, right? So could you explain a bit, at least based on some of the work that you've done, how the sanctions are currently hollowing out the middle classes and perhaps impoverishing Iran more, where you have people who maybe were previously more middle class falling into the working classes.
I don't want to lose the trail of thought uh, regarding the last question, the last sentence, which is very good, and I want to come back to it. But I thought I'll make a point that's useful for this discussion we are having. And the point being that Iran's relations with imperial Russia and maybe colonial Great Britain and so on is different from the relations Iran has with US and sanctions. Mm-hmm. Iranians all agreed that losing part of the Caucasus to the Tsarist regime was bad. And they blamed the government for Iranian government, some of them, they blamed the Iranian government for having lost that territory. Colonial powers in general, the way they hurt Iran was visible to everybody. They would be inside the country with their guns, throwing their weight around. I'm talking about Great Britain in south of Iran. Now, the U.S. hasn't done that. What U.S. has done with sanctions is what we call in the book the invisible war. And invisible war is also invisible to a lot of Iranians, which allows people to think that maybe America is not at fault. Maybe Iranian government is at fault for being belligerent and not agreeing to things. That is a fundamental change in the sort of anti-colonial experience. When the colonial power comes with obvious offensive measures and people rally behind the government, I'm thinking of Algeria, Vietnam, and so on. In the case of sanctions, because they are like a Cold War, people can disagree whether U.S. is justified or not justified, which is why Iranians are divided on whose fault it is. You see people come protest in Iran, blaming their own government. The slogans being "Give up on Gaza, give up on Lebanon," my life sacrificed for Iran. This the slogan that has been coming up every time there's big protests. I explained that by the fact that sanctions are an invisible war, and the government has difficult time rallying people around the so-called flag. And Iranians are not strangers to austerity, which is now hitting everyone, almost everyone in Iran. They fought the war. It was very austere times during the war with Iraq in the 1980s. Then there was a Rafsanjani structural adjustment. There was again austerity, prices rising, 50% inflation, lack of jobs. They tolerated that at the time because they saw Saddam was the culprit in the war. Then they saw the logic behind the moving back towards markets from the coupon system, rationing system during the war. So they tolerated the loss of living standards much, much better than now. Sanctions have had their own media support, being that it's your government that's causing the problem. It's not sanctions, it is mismanagement, it's corruption, which we show in the book that that's not really true.
No, I mean, you're making a good point about imperialism and the different forms of imperialism as well. But you're also my question was about the hollowing out of the middle classes, right. And I guess that's perhaps one reason why during the protests in Iran, the Jina Mahsa Amini protests for women life freedom, that maybe there weren't so many people from all aspects of society taking part, because if people are so affected by sanctions and there's this hollowing out of the middle class and people are becoming more impoverished, then they can't just, give up everything to go out on the streets and protest the regime. They're not able to organize to the same degree as they perhaps would be if they had more economic prosperity or better living standards. So the sanctions have perhaps impacted the middle classes and working classes in that way.
Well, they definitely have impacted all classes. And my concern about the middle class that I've written before, and it was also in the book, is because of the particular role they have. everybody knows that the real suffering is with the poor because they have nowhere to go lower. The middle class can fall to lower middle class. They can cut back on their food consumption, on their vacations, and so on, and keep their daughter still in school, right? But if you're very poor and you lose your job and you can't buy food, then sending your daughter to wash clothes in the neighborhood and so on might seem like a very good option than letting her go to secondary school, right? So with that point made that the real suffering is with the poor, the middle class suffering has a particular cost in terms of long-term social and political growth. The poor look to the middle class to strive to make their lives better. And the middle class, where countries have prospered, has also looked back at the poor and tried to level the playing field and level the path for them to become middle class, like electing governments in Europe that vote for social protection. It's the middle class that champions the cause of the poor that becomes legislation that creates the social democracy that a lot of Europeans are proud of. Unfortunately, in Iran, that hasn't happened. First of all, the middle class is weaker. We know at least 5, 6 million, maybe 10 million who were middle class by income measures are no longer middle class. By every other measure, they're still middle class, the way they treat their kids, schooling of their kids, and lifestyle, and so on. They are middle class, but they have become very weak, and they are more concerned, for example, buying enough dollars, putting it away so that when their son or daughter reaches college age, they can go abroad for schooling or for a master's degree and so on. So for them, the calculation is very complex about regime change versus taking care of themselves. Iranian government is very good with protecting the poor, relatively speaking. They have one of the most effective cash transfer programs. That's off and on. It came in 2010 under Ahmadinejad, who was a populist. He tried to use the savings from increase in the price of energy and bread to give as cash to the people. And they set up a system that continues to this day. Although the money that was allocated at the time has become really nothing because prices have gone up by 20, 30 times. But Raisi government added to that cash transfer. He removed the subsidy for food through the concessionary subsidized exchange rate. He used that savings to increase cash transfers. But those are now 3 years old and have lost 2/3 of their value. But essentially, Iranian government has the electronic address of every person in Iran and can deposit money in their accounts to make sure they can buy bread, which is still very cheap in Iran relative to the neighborhood. So I would say the poor are easier taken care of than the middle class. The way I describe the middle class and their aspirations is not where Iranian government is good at. Provide hope for the young people so they study hard, they want to go to college, they want to form families, they want to stay in Iran. Sometimes I feel like Iranian government doesn't like the middle class because the middle class has demands on the government like social freedoms, political freedoms that the government is unable to provide. So you hear in Iran that if you don't like it here, leave the country. That is a very bad way of trying to encourage a section of society that in every historical experience is the engine of growth. Are the people who invest, are the people who demand services from the government, and are the people who help the poor join them in a generation or so. So that's what I can say about the way sanctions have have created divisions within the society. The poor kind of feeling that the government can take care of them, although not all of them are being taken care of, but the middle class feeling like this government is not for them. And I think the last round of elections, we saw a little bit of movement in that direction. I would say the election of Pezeshkian, who is probably the best representative of a pious middle class in Iran. He's sophisticated, he's a surgeon, he believes in individual freedoms, but he also understands that the Islamic Republic is in a very difficult geopolitical situation. I know he's not doing too well with the promises he made, but he's the best hope for the middle class at present. Much better than Ahmadinejad, who is also a middle class type of a representative, a populist, because Pezeshkian understands the value of education and understands that a middle class family primarily is interested in having a good future for their children. And he knows, just to go back to sanctions, that without some sanctions relief, some access to global markets, that dream of the middle class cannot be fulfilled. And I'm happy to go into that a little bit more because we discuss in the book, there are two kinds of sanctions on oil and sanctions on financial exchange that have different effect on the middle class.
And that was part one of my discussion with economist Djavad Salehi-Isfahani. Make sure you look out for part two. See you next time.